The scream came just as I was testing the strength of the knots I'd tied between two oaks by the lake. "You can't do that. That's community property." I turned slowly, already knowing who it was before I saw her. Violet Whitmore, vice president of the Lakewood Pines HOA and self-proclaimed queen of the shoreline. Late 50s, bleach blonde bob, neon pink visor, and a voice that could strip paint off a wall. I stayed calm. "Good morning to you too, Violet." She charged down the grassy hill in her spotless white sneakers, clutching her clipboard like it had divine authority. "You are not allowed to set up personal equipment on HOA land. That's a violation of Section C, subsection 3 recreational installments." I was already shaking my head. "I read the bylaws. Hammocks aren't listed, and this isn't permanent. I'm just relaxing by the lake for a few hours. Nothing's being built." Her eyes twitched. "I don't care. The board hasn't approved this. Take it down or I'll have you fined." I crossed my arms. "You don't have the authority to issue fines without a notice, and you know it." Violet's face turned red. "Don't you talk to me like I don't know the rules, Quentin Grady." "I helped write them." I couldn't help but laugh, which only made her more furious. "Fine," she snapped. "You want to be difficult. Let's see how the sheriff feels about you damaging HOA property." "Damaging, Violet, it's a hammock. It's tied around trees. And trees are part of the community landscape," she shouted, dialing her phone with trembling hands. "This is destruction of common assets." I leaned back in the hammock with a sigh, letting her rant while I gently rocked. I wasn't worried. I had already called the county office last week and confirmed it was legal. The lakefront was technically public easement land, and as long as I wasn't drilling or setting up permanent fixtures, I could picnic, fish, or nap in peace. But Violet didn't care about rules. She cared about control. And today she thought she had a win. 20 minutes later, a brown and white sheriff's SUV rolled up, tires crunching the gravel. Deputy Morales stepped out, sunglasses low on his nose, giving us both a once-over. "Afternoon." "Got a call about some property damage." Violet marched right up to him. "Yes, this man is vandalizing HOA property and refusing to remove this thing," she said, jabbing a finger at my hammock like it was a loaded weapon. Deputy Morales looked over at me. "That true?" I stayed in the hammock. "Nope, it's a hammock. It's tied around two trees, no nails, no screws, just enjoying the day." Morales nodded slowly, walked over and tested the ropes himself. Clean setup." He looked back at Violet. "Ma'am, this isn't a violation. This land is part of the public easement zone. He's within his rights." Violet's mouth dropped open. But I'm on the board. I have authority here." Morales raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, being on the HOA doesn't override county law. You can't call in false reports." "That is a violation." She froze. I watched the color drain from her face like someone had shut off the electricity. "Wait, what? No, I didn't. This isn't a false report," she stammered. Morales pulled out his notepad. "You said he was damaging property. There's no damage, that's a problem. HOA or not, you can't waste department resources." I sat up in the hammock, grinning. "Should I take it down now, or can I enjoy the breeze a little longer?" Morales smiled faintly. "You're good, just pack it up by sunset." Violet stood there, stunned, as Morales walked back to his cruiser. And I laid back, hands behind my head, rocking gently, while the queen of the shoreline stood there speechless for once. The next morning, the lake was quiet again, mist curling off the water like a secret it didn't want to share. I sat on the dock with a thermos of black coffee, flipping through the latest edition of Lakewood Living, the glossy monthly newsletter Violet insisted on hand delivering to every mailbox. It was mostly thinly veiled PR for the board photos of themselves at events they barely organized, flowery language about community harmony, and, predictably, a new section titled Unapproved Uses of Shared Spaces. I read the paragraph twice, then a third time, just to be sure I wasn't misinterpreting. It stated that temporary installations including but not limited to hammocks, tents, or any personal recreational apparatus may not be placed on common areas unless expressly authorized by the Board of Directors in writing. Dated yesterday. No vote mentioned. No meeting minutes cited. I muttered, "They're rewriting the rules overnight." That's when I decided it was time I stopped being reactive. Violet wasn't just overstepping, she was trying to turn her personal vendettas into policy. I drove straight to the county records office and spent the better part of the morning requesting every documented amendment to the HOA bylaws over the past 3 years. It took some digging, but I eventually found what I suspected. The last approved amendment on record was from 17 months ago. Nothing about hammocks, nothing about temporary installations, nothing at all that matched what was in the new newsletter. The newsletter, as it turned out, wasn't just misleading, it was a fabrication. That meant someone on the board was publishing false HOA regulations and distributing them as if they were legally binding. I took photos of the newsletter and matched them against the official bylaws. Then I made copies. If Violet wanted to play games, I was ready to bring a rulebook of my own. Back at the lake that afternoon, I spotted her near the pavilion, clipboard in hand, flanked by 2 of her usual allies, Ken Draper, the HOA treasurer who never looked up from his calculator, and Doreen Millis, the secretary whose only contribution was nodding at whatever Violet said. I approached calmly. "Hey Violet, got a minute?" She didn't look up. "If this is about your hammock again, I suggest you read the new guidelines, page 3. "Funny thing about that," I said, holding up the newsletter. "I did. Then I read the official bylaws on file with the county. This isn't in there, which means this." I tapped the page. "Isn't legal." Doreen blinked. Ken looked confused. Violet's grip on her clipboard tightened. "I don't need a lecture from someone who's barely been here 2 years, she said stiffly. "You do if you're distributing fraudulent rules and claiming they're enforceable," I replied. "You didn't vote on this. There's no record of amendment. You're trying to make up restrictions and pass them off as law. That's HOA fraud." Violet's expression shifted just slightly, not fear, not yet, but recognition that I wasn't bluffing. "You're twisting this," she said. "We have the right to clarify existing guidelines. Clarify, sure. Invent, no. And if you're printing and distributing false documents, that's misrepresentation." I called the county clerk. "They're opening an inquiry." Ken finally spoke. "Wait, an inquiry? What kind of inquiry?" I looked at him. "A formal investigation into whether the board is illegally altering rules without homeowner votes. If the county finds that's happening, they can suspend enforcement authority until the election cycle. You'd lose all power." Doreen's mouth parted like she was about to speak, but Violet cut her off. "You wouldn't dare." "I already did. And just so you know, I also contacted 4 other residents who have had issues with fake fines over the past year. Turns out one of them saved every notice, complete with board signatures and dates." I pulled out a folder. None of the dates line up with official minutes. Not one. Violet's face went still in a way that made me think of snakes before they strike. "You're trying to dismantle the entire board over a hammock. This isn't about hammocks. It's about abuse of authority, and you've been getting away with it for too long. People are afraid to say anything because they think the HOA has unchecked power. But it doesn't, not when it breaks the law." Ken stepped back. "I didn't sign off on any of that stuff. If what he's saying is true," Violet turned to him, voice sharp. "We've always clarified policies without going through a vote. It's standard." "No," I said. "It's not. And if you keep doing it, the board can be dissolved for breach of fiduciary duty. The county will appoint a temporary administrator if it gets that far." Violet opened her mouth, then shut it again. Her eyes flicked between the folder in my hand and the growing number of neighbors who were starting to gather nearby, watching from a distance. One of them was Karen Renshaw, a retired attorney who once represented homeowners in civil disputes. She raised an eyebrow at me and gave a little nod. She knew exactly what was happening. I leaned in, lowering my voice just enough that only Violet could hear. "If I were you, I'd start preparing a statement for the annual meeting. Because if you don't step down voluntarily, I'll bring this folder, the county's findings, and the testimonies from every resident you've targeted. And trust me, once this hits the HOA Oversight Council, you're done. For the first time since I'd met her, Violet didn't have a retort, no shouting, no threats, just silence. I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there with her clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield she realized wasn't bulletproof. That evening, I got a knock at my door. It was Karen. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, carrying a thick binder and a flash drive. "I've been waiting for someone to stand up to her," she said. "I used to handle HOA abuse cases in state court. I've seen what happens when people like Violet get too comfortable. They start thinking bylaws are optional. They're not. I've got a ton of precedent documentation and a few contacts still in the system." She dropped the binder on my kitchen table. "Let's take them apart, piece by piece." I couldn't help but grin. "Let's make it official." The next morning, I filed a formal petition to suspend the HOA board pending an audit. Karen co-signed as a former legal representative of the district. Within 48 hours, we had 27 signatures from residents, enough to force a vote. Violet must have felt the walls closing in, because the following day she scheduled an emergency town hall in the clubhouse, which, unsurprisingly, was just a desperate attempt to sway public opinion. But things had already shifted. People showed up with questions. Real ones. And they weren't accepting vague answers anymore. Ken kept glancing at the exit like he didn't want to be there. Doreen refused to speak at all. And when I stood up to read from the actual bylaws, line by line, and compared them to the fabricated ones Violet had distributed, the room went silent. Then murmurs. Then outrage. She tried to shout over it, tried to regain control. But it was too late. Authority built on fear crumbles fast when people stop being afraid. And that night, for the first time since the HOA formed, the board was officially placed under internal review. The shackles Violet had used to control the neighborhood had been snapped. Not with force, but with facts and a hammock. 2 days after the emergency town hall, the audit team from the county oversight office arrived. They didn't come in quietly. 3 sedans with government plates pulled up mid-morning and parked directly in front of the Lakewood Pines clubhouse. The lead investigator, a no-nonsense woman in a charcoal pantsuit named Celeste Minter, walked in like she already knew how bad it was going to be. She carried a tablet, a recorder, and zero tolerance for nonsense. I watched from my porch as the board members were summoned one by one for interviews. Not just Violet, but Ken, Doreen, and even the 2 alternates who'd never cast a vote in public. Each of them shuffled inside like students headed to the principal's office. One of the alternates, a guy named Russ who mostly kept to himself, looked downright queasy. Karen called me as soon as she saw the sedans. She'd already prepped a packet of exhibits and handed them off to Celeste that morning. A timeline of suspect rule changes, copies of unvoted amendments, and 3 notarized testimonies from residents who'd received fines for non-existent violations. By the time I showed up to the clubhouse, Celeste had just finished questioning Violet. She stepped outside with a clipboard in her hand and walked directly over to me and Karen. "You're Quentin Grady." Her tone was clipped efficient. "That's right," I said. "You the one untangling this mess," she gave a curt nod. "We've got enough discrepancies in documentation to establish probable cause for board misconduct. But there's something else. Something serious." Karen tilted her head. "Serious how?" Celeste glanced around, lowered her voice slightly. "We uncovered evidence during the document sweep suggesting the HOA was funneling fines into a discretionary account that wasn't listed in their annual financial reports. That's misappropriation of community funds." Karen's eyes narrowed. "That's embezzlement." Celeste nodded once. "We've already contacted the district attorney. Depending on the final audit results, this could turn into a criminal case." I felt something tighten in my chest. "How much money are we talking about?" Celeste looked at her tablet. "So far, we've identified nearly $72,000 in undocumented penalties and processing fees. most of it routed through checks that were deposited into a separate HOA-managed account at a local credit union. The treasurer's name, Ken Draper, is on all of them. Karen folded her arms. Is he under arrest? Not yet, but he's been temporarily suspended from all financial duties. If the district attorney finds enough during the forensic review, charges will follow. That afternoon, word spread fast. Residents who'd been silent for years started speaking up. A retired contractor revealed that he was once fined over $2,000 for unauthorized paint color on his shutters, even though the color had been approved 2 years prior. A young couple down the street admitted they'd paid 3 separate violation fees without question, afraid they'd be reported to collections. None of them had ever seen copies of the actual violations. By sunset, a full crowd had gathered around the clubhouse. No one shouted. No one needed to. The silence was heavier than outrage. Everyone was just waiting for the other shoe to drop. Violet appeared at the doorway just before dark. She didn't speak to anyone. She looked smaller somehow, like the air had gone out of her. Her eyes scanned the crowd, but no one met her gaze anymore. The power she'd clung to for years had evaporated. The next morning, the official notice went out. The county had placed the entire Lakewood Pines HOA board under administrative receivership. A neutral third-party manager would take control of all operations effective immediately, pending criminal investigations. Violet's name wasn't on the notice, neither was Ken's. They were done, but the story didn't end there. 2 days later, Karen showed up on my porch with a file folder and that same sharp focus she'd had since day one. "You need to see this," she said, stepping inside and laying documents across my kitchen table. Celeste shared a few things with me off the record. "You remember that discretionary account?" "Yeah," I said. "The one Ken was managing." "Well, it wasn't just for padding HOA fines. Turns out they were using it to pay for private security patrols that weren't authorized. Look at this invoice." She slid a paper toward me. $5,000. Monthly? For a company called Hightower Compliance Services. Never heard of them. Neither had I, so I did some digging. Turns out it's not a licensed security company. It's an LLC formed last year by Violet's nephew in another county. No insurance, no oversight. Just a P.O. box and a bank account. I stared at the invoice. So she was paying her own family with HOA funds. Illegally, Karen said. That's procurement fraud at minimum. 2 days later, the county issued a warrant for Violet's arrest. She was taken into custody at her home early in the morning without warning. The sheriff's office confiscated her work laptop and several boxes of documents from her garage. She didn't resist. According to Celeste, she didn't even speak. Just handed over her keys and stood there in slippers, watching her world unravel. Ken was arrested that same afternoon. His charges were even more serious: embezzlement, forgery, and falsifying financial records. The DA's office announced that they would be prosecuting both cases as felonies. Doreen resigned quietly the same day, slipping a letter into the interim manager's mailbox and disappearing from the neighborhood entirely. The next HOA meeting was unlike anything Lakewood Pines had ever seen. It wasn't in the clubhouse. It was held outside, under a rented canopy near the lake. No microphones, no stage. Just folding chairs and the soft sound of water lapping nearby. Karen stood at the front, holding a simple clipboard. No titles, no fanfare. She looked out at the residents, all of whom sat quietly waiting. "We're not here to replace one power structure with another," she said. "We're here to build something accountable, transparent, human. And it starts with electing people who remember they serve the community, not the other way around." That night, I walked back to the same pair of trees by the lake, the same ones that started this whole thing. I tied up my hammock again, just as the sun dipped below the waterline. No one shouted this time. No one protested. In fact, someone brought over a cooler and asked if I wanted a drink. I stretched out in the hammock, looked at the stars, and realized the lake had never been the problem. It was the people who thought they owned it, and now they didn't. By the following week, The neighborhood was in the middle of a quiet transformation. The absence of Violet's constant surveillance didn't just lift a weight, it opened a door. For the first time in years, people lingered on their porches past dusk. Children played near the lake without their parents keeping one eye on the path for clipboard patrols. A few residents even brought out lawn chairs and gathered near the clubhouse lawn, passing around lemonade and stories like they remembered how to be neighbors again. But underneath the calm, something else was building. Celeste had warned us that the investigation would likely uncover more than just financial misconduct. The deeper the audit team went, the more inconsistencies they found: missing invoices, duplicate payments, and a string of checks made out to vendors no one had ever heard of. The county's forensic accountant, a man named Gregory Huxley, started cross-referencing addresses tied to those checks. That's when the real storm hit. One of the addresses didn't belong to a business at all. It led to a small property 2 towns over, a rundown duplex registered under an alias that, when traced, looped directly back to Doreen. Not only had she been quietly authorizing payments to sham service providers, but she'd also been laundering the money through shell companies that she and her daughter had set up over the years. Landscaping services that were never performed, pool maintenance in months when the pool had been closed. Even the holiday decorations, those absurdly overpriced icicle lights that Violet insisted on every winter, had been purchased through a front company. The DA's office moved quickly after the evidence hit their desk. Doreen was arrested early on a Thursday morning while trying to clean out a storage unit on the edge of town. Inside it, investigators found boxes of HOA documents, shredded bank statements, and several blank checkbooks tied to a defunct business account. Celeste called Karen and me into the administrative office that afternoon. "This goes deeper than we thought," she said, laying out the printed records. "We have a 3-person conspiracy to defraud residents, misuse elected authority, and conceal financial activity through fraudulent documentation. That's racketeering under state law." Karen's voice was steady. "Are you going to file charges under RICO?" Celeste nodded. "Already started the paperwork." By the end of the week, the charges were formally announced: racketeering, fraud, conspiracy, misappropriation of community funds. Violet, Ken, and Doreen were all named in the indictment. Their mugshots made the local news cycle, and for the first time, the narrative flipped. The HOA board wasn't a symbol of order anymore, it was a cautionary tale. One morning, I was walking back from the mailbox when I saw a man in a gray button-down leaning over the community bulletin board near the clubhouse. He was pinning up a printed flyer. As I got closer, I recognized the seal of the county oversight office. "Public Election Forum," it read. "Nominate and elect new HOA representatives, open to all residents." The man turned around. "Morning, you Quentin?" "Yeah," I said. "You're with the oversight group, name's Miles. I'm the interim facilitator for the transition. Thought you might want the first word at the forum." "You've earned it." I accepted the invitation, not because I wanted power, but because I understood now what happened when people like Violet were left unchecked. Power wasn't the problem. Apathy was. The forum was set for the following Saturday, held in the open field just north of the lake. No stage, no microphones, just folding chairs and a community that had finally started talking to one another again. Karen and I arrived early. She brought her binder, even though she didn't need it anymore. It had become her shield, her symbol that knowledge still mattered. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't make a speech, I just told the truth. "I didn't move here to start a fight," I said. "I tied a hammock between 2 trees because I wanted to enjoy the place I paid to live in." What happened next wasn't about rope or trees or sunsets, it was about someone deciding that rules only applied when they said so. We let it go for too long, and it nearly cost us everything. A few people nodded, some clapped, but most just sat quietly listening. That was enough. After the final candidate spoke, we cast our votes. Paper ballots. Simple. Honest, when the results were tallied, the new board was announced. Karen was elected president. A former firefighter named Lewis took treasurer. A retired school principal named Marcia volunteered as secretary. None of them had ever served before. None of them wanted to control anything. They just wanted to protect what we had left. That night, as the sun dipped below the lake and the crowd slowly drifted away, Karen and I sat on a bench near the shore. She passed me a folded sheet of paper. "What's this?" I asked. "County resolution," she said. "They're dissolving the HOA's enforcement authority for the next 2 years. All rule changes must now be approved by a 2/3 majority of residents." I unfolded the paper and read it. It was real, official. A safeguard against future tyrants. Karen leaned back, her voice softer than usual. "We can't make people good, but we can make it harder for them to be bad." I looked out at the water, calm and steady. "When I moved here," I said, "I just wanted peace." "You got it," she said. "You just had to fight for it first." As the stars came out, a few kids ran by with flashlights, laughing. No one stopped them, no one shouted. The trees stood tall, undisturbed, and the hammock, still there, still swinging gently in the breeze. No threats, no fines, just freedom. Earned, not granted.